Mr. Arman, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel. Thank you so much once again for taking the time to speak to us. Now, let me start by asking you, what does Russia's invasion of Ukraine mean for the Middle East? Are Middle Eastern governments, including America's traditional allies such as Egypt, hedging their bets between Russia and the US-backed Ukrainian army? Or are they playing on time and waiting to see to better evaluate the situation on the field?
Look, to be honest, Harun, that's a great question, but the condition in Ukraine and the Russo-Ukrainian war has been a very, very complicating matter to the Middle Eastern. I mean, there are opportunities and also threats for both of them. The nations in the Middle East are confused because, first of all, at the beginning of the war, many people, at least those who were relying on the United States, they expected that a stronger support of the U.S. U.S. support of Ukraine prior to the war, which sent not the most pleasant, signals to the Middle Eastern nations. But on the other hand, countries like Iran and Syria, who've been relying on Russia, also they are receiving a very, very confusing message because the Russian military campaign in Ukraine is way slower than what we anticipated. The casualty is way higher than what we anticipated. And also in terms of technological warfare, the sinking of the Moscow's battleship, it kind of gives the signal that Russia still has a lot to make up to be able to catch up with the West. Thus, even countries like Iran and Syria are possibly thinking that have they chose this right side or the right party as an ally, given to what's happening in Ukraine. So I think it is very safe to say that as of now, at least most of the Middle Eastern countries are confused. They don't want to clearly get sides, at least countries except Iran and Syria for their own consideration. The rest of them, they want to stay neutral as possible and to have more time to anticipate and estimate where we are heading.
Mm-hmm. Now, Russia, which has now eclipsed Iran as the most sanctioned country in the world, clearly wants the world to feel the economic pain of an embargo on Russian oil and gas. Would a nuclear deal that ends the embargo against Iranian oil mitigate the global financial consequences of Russia's isolation?
That's a very good question, and also takes us back to the first question when I said that it's very complicating. The reason that it's complicating because on one hand, right now, the situation for Iran is very, very actually pleasant. The price of oil is going high. The Europeans are trying to replace their import from Russia with the new resources. And in terms of the size of the resource, Iran next to Russia has the largest gas resource. And geographically speaking, Iran has the similar approximately to Europe. So Iran is a potential, exporter to the Europe, and financially speaking, it can give Iran, a raise in national revenue. But on the other hand, Iran has a consideration when it comes to its relation and cooperation with Russia. And we have witnessed that the Russians also are very concerned that Iran might replace them. President Putin just in late March in a meeting with his cabinet, he said that the United States is making moves to reconcile with Venezuela and Iran, and the reason is to replace them with Russia to counter Russian energy market. And also we have witnessed in this light that the Russians try to kind of semi-sabotage the negotiation between West and Iran over the re-implementation of the JCPOA. We noticed that in mid-March, when the negotiations were reaching a new peak, for all of a sudden, Mr. Sergei Lavrov, for the Russian Foreign Ministry, came up with a new demand and asking a written assurance from West that the sanction against Russia over the war in Ukraine would not affect the cooperation between Iran and Russia security-wise and military-wise. A week later than that statement, Mr. Levin Jarganyan, Russia's ambassador to Iran, also said that in an interview with the Etemad newspaper that Iran owes a great amount of money. He didn't specify about the amount to Russia and to Russian contractor regarding its nuclear project, and we are concerned, meaning Russians, that the U.S. sanctions would block Iran's way to repay. All of this created a hold and a pause in Iranian negotiation with West. Although later Russian came up and say that they have received a written assurance from the West, but neither the United States confirmed it nor they published the written assurance. But still, all of the media reports comes that indicating that Russia is turning to be a kind of a major obstacle in Iranian or in a Western, negotiation. And Iran also obviously doesn't want to bypass Russia this position in this situation. There is not in interest of the Islamic Republic of Iran to bypass Russia or to distance itself from Russia. You know, Iran heavily is relying on cooperation with Russia in Syria, and also Iran always saw Russia and China as a suitable alternative to power. Iranians have been obtained what is known as a pivot to East foreign policy for about 4 decades. And they believe now it is time that all of the development are indicating the power has been transferring from West to East, and it is time for Iran to stay loyal to the Eastern power, including Russia and China, because the new world will be in their hand.
Now, Arman, I don't know if you agree with me, but I have a feeling that President Vladimir Putin does not feel threatened by Iran's nuclear advancement, and it seems that Tehran's isolation has served Russia's interests. Would a Western-oriented Iran be worse for Russia than a nuclear-armed Iran?
You know, if the situation continues as it is, you know, if the escalation between West and Russia over multiple reasons, including Ukraine, because there is a chance that escalation also grew to the Moldavia, to Georgia again, and the rest of the world, and also Belarus. If the escalation continues, one can argue that maybe it is in interest of the Russia that we have a nuclear Iran, or we at least have an Iran which is very, very close to achieve their nuclear capability, because it would create a diversion for West. You know, any conflict with Iran or any threat that been imposed by or from Iran would divert at least partially Western's attention from the Eastern Europe to Iran to the Middle East and Persian Gulf, especially in a situation that Europe is moving forward to, you know, replacing Russia with their new resources from Middle East and also North Africa. We have heard about the Italian agreement with Algeria to import gas and oil from Algeria. So any tension in the Middle East at this point at least would be a positive development for Russia, because it would again divert at least partially the attention and the focus of the West from the Ukraine and Russia's surrounding area to the Middle East.
Right, and I would just like very briefly to touch upon food security. The Russian war in Ukraine has presented countries such as Egypt with two major immediate obstacles. Egypt, for example, is the world's top importer of wheat and sources 85% of its wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Will the Egyptian government and other Middle Eastern governments need to use more of their financial resources to secure wheat supplies and avoid threats to the country's food security, but also social instability?
Look, it is a very tough situation for countries, specifically speaking for Egypt, because of its, you know, its population, and also Egypt, except a very limited part of the country, doesn't have that much of suitable environment for the national agriculture. Russia and Ukraine, they've both been top producer of the, you know, foods and also wheat, as you mentioned. And Middle Eastern countries, including Iran and Egypt itself, they've been, you know, top importer to them. And Egypt, as you said, is among top ones. So the situation in Russia and Ukraine has affected the food market, and also the reliance in Middle East on importing the wheats from the foreign countries. But the problem, there are other sources that they might try to, you know, to replace Russia with it. But the problem that they have is the tension between Russia and Ukraine as a top producer of wheat and other agricultural products cause a raise in a food, you know, in a price-wise in a food markets. But the revenue of most of the countries, specifically Egypt, which doesn't have that much of the oil and gas resources that can make up with it, stays the same. So it might be predicted, it might be kind of semi-safe to predict that in the next following months, Egypt would have to deal with the social, if not social unrest, at least social dissatisfaction over growth of, you know, price in the food markets.
Right, Mr. Arman, it was a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
It was a pleasure to me. Thank you for having me.
Sankcije Rusiji su prilika Kini da stavi Moskvu pod svoje okrilje i učini je ovisnom o kineskom kapitalu. Peking može ne samo pružiti ekonomski spas Rusiji na taj način učiniti Moskvu više ovisnom, već i jednostrano djelovati u vezi sa Tajvanom. Sankcije Rusiji također stvaraju nove mogućnosti za kineske tehnološke kompanije da povećaju tržišni udio u toj zemlji. Na kraju, zategnuti odnosi Zapada i Rusije mogu ubrzati proces dedolarizacije svjetske ekonomije. Poštovani gledalci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice Istoka. Ako ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našoj web stranici balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.